Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's program, Top Trends in Commercial Banking 2020. I'm Rich Melville, Editorial Director for the Banking and Capital Markets Group at Horizont. If you haven't heard the name Horizont before, it's because until yesterday we were known as Source Media. Please visit horizont.com to find out more about what's going on at our company, but enough about us for now. Let's go to the regularly scheduled programming. The commercial banking industry faces increasing external pressures that are requiring banks to reimagine and evolve their business and operating models. Rising customer expectations, disruptive competitors, new technologies, and increased regulation are just a few of the forces at play. In response, leading banks are investing aggressively to drive efficiency and enhance the client and employee experience, building toward a new digital future. Accenture has introduced 6 key trends shaping the commercial bank's transformation agenda in 2020. The combination of client work with banks all over the world, industry partnerships, and renowned research uniquely position Accenture to present these trends and help to define the characteristics of a truly digital commercial bank. With us today from Accenture are Jared Rohrer and Chris Sislowitz. Jared Rohrer is Managing Director in Accenture Banking and the Global Commercial Banking and nCino Practice Lead. He has overall accountability for defining the most important industry trends and priorities in commercial banking across the globe and aligning Accenture's teams, capabilities, and technology ecosystem partners to help clients successfully execute their strategies. Chris Sislowitz is a Managing Director in Accenture Banking and a North America Credit Practice Lead. He has overall responsibility for Accenture's consulting work across retail, small business, commercial, and corporate lending. Chris specializes in the management and delivery of transformational initiatives and platform implementations for global financial institutions. Before we move ahead to the actual 6 trends, quick housekeeping note. There will be a link visible to you to download the full report from Accenture. We'll make that visible to you toward the end of the program. We encourage you to do that. And there will be an opportunity for you to provide questions to us in the window you're looking at to view this program, and we encourage you to do that as well. A couple of questions to set the stage for the program. Can you tell us a little bit about the project that gave rise to this report, how you arrive at these trends, and maybe help bankers understand what it is they're supposed to be taking away from this?
Sure, and thanks for having us and hosting us here today in your studio. When we started this project, one of the things we really wanted to think about is how commercial banking across the globe is moving forward. Right, we look at this massive change over the last 5 years, where fintech and digital have begun to come into the commercial bank. When we look at what that has transpired into, it's a lot of work around commercial lending and loan origination, around CRM, but big giant platform plays that are beginning this digital revolution in commercial banking. What we want to do is say, what does that mean? What are the implications of that? And then what does it mean for what we need to do next?
Okay. And maybe also give us a little insight into how these were arrived at. Was this a small team effort, a big team effort? Where did the inputs for this come from?
Sure. I mean, we ultimately crowdsourced from within Accenture, both based on work we're actually performing and the work that we see coming through the pipeline. So it absolutely was a group effort. I mean, ultimately, there's a smaller group that then was responsible for distilling, but those were comprised of leaders from around the globe who got together and chatted about where do we see these ideas coalescing? What are those underarching or underpinning themes that then drive through to the trends we're going to debut today?
We talked a little earlier in discussing this, and I know you have developed insight on what you call a maturity curve.
Sure.
and where the industry sits in terms of adoption, and maybe you want to talk about that a little before we start?
Yeah, sure. So there's a graphic up on your screens. What's interesting here is again, as I think about where banks are going, and it's important to kind of frame this digital journey for commercial banks specifically. 5 years ago, I would say that the technology and the process really weren't in a position to move this work forward in a meaningful way. So you're talking about a very analog process across most of the commercial bank, across any of the banks across the globe. As we have seen the advent of these programs around, CRM, nCino, or LOS, or loan origination, I should say, we've seen banks take massive steps to digitize that end-to-end platform or that foundation. But as we look at where they are and where they need to go, they're really at the beginning of the journey. And I think that what's interesting is, after such a big investment, right, what we're seeing is banks still have a lot to do, right? So when these programs started, I think a lot of bankers might have said, we're at the end of this journey. And now we're at a position to say, wow, what we've done is just put us at the beginning of the journey, and really the best is yet to come. So as we look at this curve, what's interesting to me, and again, as we think about where banks are, both here in North America as well as across the globe, we are still seeing this position where banks are sitting in this level 1 and level 2, with an opportunity to really start to see the breakthrough into levels 3 and 4. We had to your point, as we did the crowdsourcing, we had our global leadership team here in New York a couple of months ago. We put a giant version of this up on the wall, and we plotted the top 50 banks that we do business with. Now again, that was us kind of arbitrarily plotting them, but what was fascinating is 85% of those banks were in levels 1 and 2, and almost half of those were in level 1. Right, so there is still just a tremendous amount of work to do in this space. Now, what's important for me to say here, and we'll come back to this as we talk about trend. What's important is that doesn't mean the investment wasn't the right investment. It was a necessary investment, but there's a ton coming forward as well.
But yet, that's talking about the top 50 banks. We're not talking about the mid-tier. We're talking about the very top of the top.
So great question. I don't think it applies differently outside of the top 50. We just use those as a baseline.
Got it.
But what's been fascinating to me, whether I'm in Birmingham or in Irvine or in Johannesburg or in Sydney, the conversation's the same, right? The same issues are facing banks across the globe in the commercial banking space.
So you used the word foundation. I think that's a nice way to segue to our first trend, which
Sure.
I believe you're going to discuss with us, beyond the digital foundation.
Yeah. So beyond the digital foundation, right? So I was framing a little bit of this just now, but as we move away from, or banks are moving away from some of these core platform decisions they've made and implementations around the likes of an Encino and a Salesforce or Dynamics, whatever that might be. The promise, right, and again, it goes back to where the promise that banks were making and leaders were making is, when I get done with these two programs, I've transformed my commercial bank, right, and I'm there, and I've arrived. And I think that the reality is those programs are making significant improvements, right, no doubt about it, fundamentally better RM engagement tools, right, but is adoption where we want it to be, right? Are the tools doing what we need for an RM? Not entirely, right? From an loan origination perspective or anywhere payments, we're seeing the improvements coming in, but the question is, are you getting beyond increased cycle times, faster times to yes? Are you really driving into the analytics and the opportunity that's really with us in the future? And that's where we really see this going, is how do you start to push forward, right? And I think about a couple of things that sort of jump out, right? So over the past 10 years, we've seen $27 billion of investment in fintechs in just the commercial banking space. Okay, that includes card, right? That includes treasury management, SME lending, all those kind of things. But that is a ton of investment, right? And when I think about where most of our banks are today, right, we're just starting to see where that value is going to come forward. So the question becomes, you've built something, it's really powerful, it's moved you away from a fundamentally analog process, it's digitized what you have, it's begun to unlock data, so what are you going to do about it, and how are you going to differentiate?
The number 27 billion is a gigantic number, and it's emblematic of all the work that's gone into this. And I'm sure there must be some people in the audience thinking to themselves, not just that we said we were going to do this and it was going to fix our commercial banking business, but we were told it was going to fix our commercial banking business. And don't they have a right at this point to feel some kind of investment or adoption fatigue? Is that an okay way to look at it? Am I going too far with that?
No, I think it's absolutely fair, right? Banks have put tremendous amount of dollars into their transformation efforts, and they've come out the other side with improvements,
Absolutely.
Substantial improvements. But I think if you think about this in terms of building a house, right? There's a lot more investment in buying the land, building the foundation, and setting the frame than there is in putting up the drywall. And that's really the stage that we're at, right? Is we have a home now, we have a roof over our heads, and now it's time to figure out how we're going to go enhance it with all the bells and whistles. Let's go ahead and put in the wireless networks and all the fancy smart appliances, so to speak, right? So the incremental investment is substantially less than that foundation.
Now, the thing I'd say to the idea of fatigue, right? There's a couple of points. It's an important point, right? There's a lot going on, and these have been billed as big transformation programs that have come with big change and adoption programs, and those have been really good, right? But one thing that is really important is there is a new way of doing business, right? As we think about digital banking and we think about technology and how it affects our lives every day, if you're standing still, you're not doing anything, right? So banks have to switch the paradigm, and are beginning to say, I am in a continuous innovation environment. And if I'm not continuously innovating, I'm falling behind, right? And if I'm not doing the things we've already talked about that are foundational, I'm already behind. And then how do I begin to catch up, and how do I do those things? But the idea of fatigue is important, right? Folks need to think about it differently. One of the things I talk about commercial banks all day long is these programs, right? The ones that are driving, your CRM and your Encino programs. As you're doing those things, right? Those are the programs with that leadership that becomes the nerve cell of all the decisions you make in the bank. So this isn't a project team. This is your future leadership team. This is the spine, the nerve center of the commercial bank, where you derive the right decision making, you derive the right empowerment, you own process control, technology, and not in a true technologist kind of way, but you own all those things and the inputs into that, where you're building the future leaders. And frankly, you got the coolest job in the commercial bank. Right, so as you think about that becomes that paradigm to think about how you change the entire mindset, and then you certainly have to go out in front line and think about change and focus and how you make sure you're doing that deliberately. But there is a fundamental mind shift, and it's seismic in how we think about change and technology and digital transformation.
I guess on some level this goes to the nature of how competition itself is changing for the industry. In various lines of business, you may be up against a challenger bank instead of a traditional bank.
Yeah.
And those banks, by their nature, often are much more digital first. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're going to hear us talk a little bit about legacy baggage in a bit, but digital challenger banks, they don't have it, right? And that's an important component. I was down in Melbourne at the beginning of December, and I was walking in to meet with a digital challenger bank. And as I was waiting for the meeting, there were screens behind me that were just kind of on repeat, and it was like, do you hate your big bank? Yep. Do you hate how slow their processes are? Can you envision a path that's different, that's fast and trusted, and has the right decisions in mind for you and for the credit and for the bank? And it was just like, again, as a former banker, right, when I looked at that, I was cringing, because I was like, wow, this is a scary and fundamental shift. But as you look at those business models, I mean, they're, if left alone, they're going to eat the bank's lunch, right? Now, I think that the scale becomes a really important component of what the large banks have, but it is fundamentally changing the game. These digital challenger banks have a way of going in, looking at things, identifying an acute problem, and rapidly iterating to it. Doesn't make them perfect, but it makes them interesting, it makes them challenge, and it makes our larger banks have to lean in, right, and have this posture that says, I've got to pay attention, I've got to use the scale I have, not get weighed down by the baggage, and move forward at a way that keeps me ahead of these guys.
That's a way to transition actually to our second trend, which goes a little bit to culture and the mindset you need in this more digital approach to commercial banking. And so I think you're going to talk about the empowered banker is the word
Sure.
you used.
Yeah. So it's funny. Nothing gets my clients more excited than talking about the empowered banker.
I almost believe you.
It's true. When we sit and talk about, and I think there's a lot going on here, right? So you think about kind of like there's a massive workforce transformation underway. Well, we'll just start there, right? So, and this isn't going to be a popular thing to say, but historically, our RMs, right, and this is fairly honest, right, but our RMs spend a lot of time on their existing book, right, cultivating that, farming it, if you will, and making sure that all of that continues to reap the benefits it needs to do. There's a bit of a, let's meet up at the country club, just check in, all that kind of stuff. And the paradigm shift is to say, if I have a farming mentality, how do I become hunters? How do I think about like driving a culture that's out building new business? Because everybody's going to, right? And I think that that's one component of what we're seeing. But I look at that and I say, okay, this is sort of where we're starting. We have a whole new entrance of a new age of a workforce in the RM space who frankly don't want to do business that way and recognize there's a whole different way. So when I look at the intersection of the RM and I look at that with technology, we see that, and there's this great visual we have that sort of, it shows this brain in the center of all this technology, right? And when I think about that, that becomes the key, right? The idea is to take an RM and empower them with the right information and right data, right? If you can provide that with them and change that culture to say, I'm a super user because I have information at my fingertips, that begins to make the shift, right? Now, the other thing I'd say, and I think this is important, right? So we've all gone through these CRM programs. We have had some results, but we haven't had the adoption we wanted, right? And I think that's fairly honest across the board, right? And when I look at that, the biggest driver I see is that we are still building management tools, okay, with CRM, and we're not building this idea of what is in it for the RM. I joke sometimes, right? We have our own tools, and I joke a little bit about that because when I go out and use our sales tools, it's at the absolute last moment, right? Because that allows me to get all the praise about winning a new piece of work without all the accountability that comes with putting it in too early, right? And when I say that to an RM, that's why they light up, right? Because it's true. Now the thing is, you've got to have the management capabilities, right, and all that accountability, but how do you make it useful for the RM? Right, and I think about like driving client insights, putting the right data out there. We've got a great set of partners that we work with in this space, and trying to figure out how you use, bank data, client data at the bank, different fintechs, our own data, to say how do I put the right insights in front of a client or in front of a client team to say there's a problem with the client, there's a potential opportunity with the client, and ultimately there's a reason I should be using this before I go on my first call. I might even be able to price it effectively, right? So I can do all those things in advance. That becomes a gravitational pull for why I want to go use that tool as opposed to today where it's only a management tool, right? That becomes the key, is how do you pivot to say, if this is useful, they're going to come use it. It goes back to Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. But what we've built is just a management tool that kind of gets our RMs beat over the head with a club, right?
So it's only trend two, but we're talking about people, and that's kind of a signal, isn't it, that you're not talking about technology displacing or working around people. This is still a people business from the point of view, at least, of this research.
No, absolutely. It's this trend in particular is about augmenting people with data, and data is a pervasive theme that's going to come up again as we talk through some of these other trends. But it's how do we take advantage of the massive amounts of data that are available, cultivate that data, and present it in a format that it's actually useful, that it's not overwhelming, that RMs aren't out there searching for data or trying to filter through and using Google alerts, right? How do I use something much more robust, much more proactive that enables me to go out and have meaningful conversation with my clients? Because the thing that we found is, and we've seen this everywhere we've been, commercial banking is still a relationship business. The relationship isn't going away. It's just, to Jared's points, the days of doing business on the golf course are different. Right now it's about what are the insights you're going to bring me? What is it how are you going to differentiate yourself as a banker from your competitors by leveraging the insights, by coming to me, by bringing me proactive ideas, by structuring deals that are more relevant to me as an individual and my company, whether that be a small business or a large corporation?
Yeah, so a couple thoughts on that. One is, when we've done some research in Europe recently and surveyed a bunch of clients, and they're like, you can charge me less for a digital-only platform, and I still want my RM. Right, so the idea of putting the RM at the center is key. Kind of going back to this broad point, I want to just kind of hit a case study, right? So we worked with a commercial bank in APAC where we really brought all this together. This RM human-centered approach that says if I have the right analytics and insights using external data, bank data, right, and I put that in the right platform, which is this is key. If it's usable data and I'm incenting and driving those behaviors, that's where you see change. This bank saw a 46% increase in applications. I mean, it's amazing, right? 40% increase in cross-sell. Those are the kind of opportunities that exist here when you get it right? And I think that the key is getting started, identifying some signals, getting something out there, even if it's small, that starts to build that gravitational pull.
Keying off the word behavior, obviously, I think it's obvious that people need to be helped along this path as well, whether it's training or whether it's development or however you develop staff. And that requires a commitment, almost as much of a commitment at least, from a financial institution to get their team in that place. Do you sense that there's that level of commitment in the industry right now to make that part work?
Ish, right? So we see it in places, right? Yep. So I think certain institutions we've seen very substantial commitments to investment in training, retooling, honestly, new leadership techniques, new behavioral techniques, and we've seen other folks who have been slower to adopt it or slower to recognize the importance and the changing role of the banker and frankly all the personnel along the life cycle as it pertains to, it doesn't matter if it's treasury or lending or whatever it is, right? That anyone who's interacting with the client has to up their game, right? We talk a little bit about emotional intelligence and how important that is to relationship banking. If you're going to talk about relationship banking, again, regardless of product, the person having that conversation, the person on your side of the table, better have the emotional intelligence to interact. And you know, we don't want to get too far down the retail banking path, but to compare that as an example, the paradox I've always found with the branch, for example, is that the key interaction point is not the senior, most informed person in the branch. You've got to get through 2 or 3 other people to get to that person, right? So we're starting to see that evolve a little bit with some of the modern day branches. But if we think about applying that to a commercial sense, it's have we made that same investment on in the RM, in the underwriter, in the back office person, in the onboarding agent, right? Have we talked through all the different folks that are going to be interacting with the client and really train them to interact in today's world and to augment self-service capabilities with actual personal interactions?
Chris, you're going to get trend 3.
Yeah, we're going to change gears a little bit here.
Yeah, intelligent automation for commercial banking.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one, right? Automation is nothing new, right? We've been talking about it for at least 5 years, arguably the better part of a decade. But I think the reality is, when we talk about RPA, robotic process automation, it was sort of presented like it was going to be this miracle bullet for all problems. And yeah, there have been isolated use cases where you can see that, but by and large, I think it's under-delivered on its promises. So, but what we see now is the evolution of that automation towards intelligence, and we pick that word specifically for 2 reasons. One, because we do see it being paired more with machine learning, with AI, to make more intelligent decisions and more intelligent routing throughout that classic cost takeout, speed, and efficiency automation play. But we also use that in intelligent words specifically to talk about the intelligent use of automation. And more specifically, the intelligent use of all the ways of automation. And some of that might include offshoring, that might include outsourcing, that might include partners, it can include fintechs. It's not just about RPA.
As you were talking, I was thinking about an analogy that people used to talk about in bank M&A. Revenues or revenue opportunities are soft, costs are hard. And in thinking about tech, you know, you have this ability to reduce costs or this ability to optimize and speed up your process. Is the bias still toward cost in the conversation often?
Sadly, I think it is, and I think that's what we're trying to change. Yeah. Is move the bias away from cost and towards quality and towards service, right? Think about it from a customer journey perspective. How is this automation going to improve and expedite my customer journey? How is that going to improve my quality? How is that going to ensure that I have repeatability? Cost will come, right? If you get those other things right, the cost takeout will come. So it's time to flip the script, so to speak, on what our primary focus is with automation.
Go ahead.
I was just going to kind of dial into the point on quality, right? I think that it gets overlooked in all of this, but everything we're talking today is about, you know, this idea of a digital transformation in the commercial bank, and anything that we're talking about requires a robust foundation, right? And it requires your process to be, you know, as standardized and simplified as possible, right? It requires you to eliminate the bespoke processing, all those kind of things. That makes you more compliant, right? It makes you more effective. But more than anything else, you can't rely on the technology to be effective if you haven't mastered the process, right? So the process stays important. In fact, it becomes more important in some respects because you can't automate something that is full of variation, right? So as you think about your digital journey, right, really dialing into where that simplification can be and how that applies to technology is key. This is not the technologist's game. It's going to be a piece of the game. But this hybrid technologist business leader, that's the way this goes, right? The business is going to have to drive this, understand how you make this idea of intelligent automation be the cornerstone of building everything else. Because if this foundation is not tight, you've got issues, right? And I think about intelligent automation, I think about outsourcing, RPA, all those things basically are enablers and empowerment of how you do that more effectively and allows everything else you're doing to come into line.
Yeah, I think in the report you specifically called out implications for outsourcing and offshoring, and maybe you want to talk about that for a moment.
Sure. Well, it's interesting. I think the long-held belief was that, okay, automation is going to replace offshoring. Ironically, it's the offshores that are doing more of the automation. The folks are looking at this saying, hey, if I don't do this to myself, and then someone will do it to me. So ironically, I think it's actually the progress has come more out of the outsourcing and the offshoring than it's been done to them.
Are there areas, lines of business that stand out right now as the sweet spot for some of what we're talking about right now?
Sure. I mean, the obvious choice is where there's volume, right? So you think about small business, you think about business banking. There's obvious application to where there's high volume of repeatable tasks. But the often overlooked areas are the bespoke processes that Jared spoke about. So maybe someone in real estate fulfillment is constantly going to a website to enter information because that website doesn't have an API. Even if they did, you're never going to get the business case dollars to integrate that system, right? You're not going to get the $500,000, $1 million to go build that integration. Well, why not spend a few $1,000s to automate that task and put that high-cost employee on a task that's more productive? So the cost save is not just about, hey, can I reduce headcount? It's about, can I take my employees and put them on more valuable tasks that are more beneficial back to that customer journey point?
I'm going to take you to, I think you're going to be leading on topic 4 as well. And this one goes to AI in a post-digital world. Post-digital.
Post-digital, yeah. That's the scary part of this right now. I mean, it's time let's start with the facts. Artificial intelligence is behind the times in commercial banking. It's only just really starting to take effect even in retail banking, which is clearly ahead of commercial banking in this space. Right. So artificial intelligence in commercial banking is not where it needs to be. However, it is rapidly coming up the curve. And I think it's high time banks sort of acknowledge that. So we see that across a couple of different areas, right? The one that's been talked about for some period of time is automated spreading, right? So we see a number of players out there in the industry that are trying to automate that process. Highly manual, highly repeatable. We've seen folks make progress with personal financial statements coming up the curve onto corporate financial statements. Still some challenges parsing footnotes and from the auditors, but we're seeing that coming up the curve. But it's not just about the automation and the cost takeout. It's about how do I enable decisions. It's about how do I bring real intelligence to the important parts of the process.
Yeah, I mean, so let me take a couple thoughts on this too, right? So one is, it's interesting. We just think about like AI is how are you using data, right? Think about it as simple as that in some respect, and it's not as simple as that, right? To Chris's point, but I pulled a stat out of it's in our report, but there's 5 zettabytes of data out there today. And I had to go look.
It must be a big number. It starts with Z.
And it's got 2 T's. It's fascinating. So I was like, how big is that? And I had to move it into something I understood. So 5 zettabytes of data on the planet. That is 900 newspapers per person on the planet.
Would that were the truth, because my business would be doing so much better.
900 zettabytes of newspapers. But it's just, I mean, the thing here that becomes really important, right, is that is just it's hard to comprehend how much data that is, right? And I kind of laugh because you take that and say, well, okay, well, banks have a lot of data. They're rich, right? And I laugh. I'm looking at you guys out there in the audience, but all the bankers tell me how rich they are because they have all this data, and it's interesting because they can't access it, and it's not really useful. It's like being rich and having a billion Zimbabwe dollars, and there's a big difference, and when we look at how banks are how they're working through it as, you've got to get this concept of a data swamp really needs to be cleaned up, and you've got to think about how your data strategy becomes the cornerstone of how you move forward, and you've got to think about where you have strengths and how AI and partners are going to help you on the outside, because this is not the game's not going to be you're building it all internally, right? You've got to figure out where you can actually drive that competitive advantage and move it forward. Chris talked about decisioning. We worked with a bank here in North America, and we've seen them actually begin to use AI in their decision-making process in the under $25 million space. They're making decisions on 75% of those in less than a day, right? So I'm pretty sure some folks just shifted in their chair, right? Because that's a pretty significant change. That means the entire industry is going to continue to shift towards faster and sooner, right? And as they do that, how are you leveraging AI to build that capability? Because you just can't do that with bodies. A body shop's not going to get you there, right? The other thing about AI and all of this is when I think about where banks have been focused over the last 4 or 5 years, it's been about cleaning up the internal house. And we're going to talk about that more in just a minute. But it's fascinating to me how internally focused everyone has been and not really focused on the customer. It's time to really get real about what this means for the customer, right? Thinking about how you're actually having, useful interchanges digitally or through your RM, right, with a client, right? We've done all this internal stuff about cleaning up our house, but what are we doing to make their lives easier? And really do that, right? Bankers talk all day long, I'm leading from the client, and the reality is we're leaning on how we're gonna get better cycle times and stuff because we're doing stuff that helps the client, but we're not directly focused on the client, right? So I think AI really helps you get there. Now, all that being said, when I look at AI, I say, this is still a foundational year. This is still baby steps, right? The work that we just talked about around intelligent automation is important. The work we're talking about, digital transformation, is important. All of those things are driving towards this, and the banks that are coming up that maturity curve the fastest are the ones that are starting to play around in this space and figure out what they're going to do. Nobody has it solved, but there are really great use cases out there, and we're starting to see them come to life.
A couple of things you said. I often ask people when they say AI, and there are hints of both of these in your response. It's massive data crunching, all the way to decision making, and here decision making by the AI as opposed to decision making supported by the AI. And I mean, where in the spectrum are we? Are we all over the place? Is there a spot? Is there not one spot?
I'd say it's all of the above. Now, the respective maturity and adoption is certainly different across that curve, right? I mean, I think there's a much higher comfort level putting AI into the repeatable machine tasks, if you will, the safe, unexposed areas of the platform or of the process. But we're really talking about AI across the patch. I mean, we are in a situation where we're talking about AIs making decisions. And that's going to make, to Jared's point, a lot of people uncomfortable. But AI making decisions doesn't displace human decisions. Humans are still writing the policy. Humans are still going to be monitoring, and there's still going to be exceptions. So it doesn't completely, we're not talking Minority Report here, right? We're not displacing humanity. But we are at a point where we have to accept that is coming, and you either embrace it or you run the risk of being obsolete.
Yeah. Now, when you talk about that, it makes me think about, like, Chris talked about retail a bit earlier, right? When I look at really dumbing down what I think AI is in commercial banking, look at what you do in your business or with your smartphone today, and how that applies in the retail space. It's all coming. I've done a presentation a few times with a colleague of mine who runs the digital retail practice for us, and we do that for an audience at commercial banks. He goes first, and he blows their minds with what he's talking about, because they're like, I just can't believe you can do that on auto loan, right? And it's like the stuff that's happening is a bit mind melting, right? And then it's everybody's really excited, and then I come up and sort of talk about the realities of, hey, congratulations on digitization and some baseline effect, but you haven't even touched the surface on some of the things you're talking about. So how do you begin to move that forward and really drive towards AI? But I think that this idea of what's happening in retail and what's happening in other businesses outside of banking, it's coming to commercial. Of course it's coming here slower. We do have more complex processes. We do have more complex clients, right? But the AI is improving, right? Our capabilities are improving. You're no longer an analog bank, right? So now how are you going to leverage the ability of being truly digital and take it to the next level?
Going to dial back to a topic we talked about a little earlier. We used the phrase legacy baggage before. Trend 5 is essentially about discarding the legacy baggage.
Yeah, so look, we come to the grim reality, right? Which is we said we were going to talk about data, we said we're going to talk about legacy platforms, and no conversation is complete without acknowledging them. While there's been tremendous investment in transformational initiatives, while those have yielded tremendous value, you start to look outside of that investment and look around, and you see a lot of systems that have still been there for 20 and 30 years. And it starts with data. Commercial data, whether it be lending or payments or whatever, is still not where we need it to be. It's improving, and as these investments start to originate new products, new loans, new onboarding processes, et cetera, that data will continue to get better. But that old stuff that's not going to run off the books for 10 years is still sitting out there and still has to be dealt with. So the reality is that we're seeing, we believe strongly that decoupling is coming to commercial banking in much the same way it came to retail banking, right? 5 years ago, this was the same problem in retail banking. And over the past few years, we've really seen folks realize that you don't have to replace your entire core banking platform in one fell swoop. You can start to decouple individual pieces of that, parcel off that data swamp we talked about, and clean and cleanse and sanitize and heal a patch or a parcel of land, and then move on to the next parcel of land. And that's what we think needs to happen with commercial banking as well, whether that's collateral data, whether that's covenant data, whatever it may be that's out there that's incomplete, that's in a text blob, that doesn't meet today's standards, and that frankly makes both the banks and the regulators squirm, right, needs to be addressed, and we actually believe that technology exists to do that. We've touched around this topic. We'll hit it head on. Historically, technology has been the limiting factor. We have reached a point where your policy and your process are now your limiting factor of your business, not technology, and that's a pretty fundamental shift and an important point, which is the technology is there to enable you to do whatever you want to do. And it's not just the cost and money that we've always heard about. It's really there. Someone is there. And if someone's not there, someone will fill that void very quickly. So it's how quickly can you adapt your process and your policy to fill that void.
You mentioned regulators just this quickly, and I have to. Regulators, I think, at least the perception is they have a bias toward the status quo when it comes to what they want to see and the response sets they want to see. I think there's also a bias out there toward single providers and not the change the part, but everything should just be part of a whole. And so some status quo inertia coming at least from the regulatory side. Is that a fair characterization?
I mean, I think it's fair, right? I mean, I will say we made it 35 minutes into a banking presentation before we got to regulators, so that might be a record. But
38.
38, awesome. So, but since we're here, look, it's a bit of a lose-lose situation. That's an ugly way to look at it, but that's I think the reality, which is banks are coming off of MRAs and consent orders. They've spent tremendous amounts of money, put in most cases, manual control processes to close those gaps and make the regulators happy. That's all well and good, but are you going to continue that process ad infinitum, right? And I think that's the other option is to attack it from an oblique angle and say, how do I bypass that process altogether? So it's going to make some people uncomfortable, right? It's like we finally got out of that MRA after 9 months. Last thing I want to do is ever talk about that again, right? Ever talk about flood again? But the reality is it's got to be addressed, or you're just going to be back to that legacy baggage point. You're going to be carrying that on ad infinitum.
Yeah, I just don't see a choice, right? As a former banker, when I look at regulatory, and I've had my own share of MRAs, which we probably wear as badges, but when I
name some names,
yeah, no, it's fine. But at the heart of almost every one of them across banking is an operational failure, a data issue, a process issue, right? And then, to your point, Chris, what's happening is banks are going and making tactical fixes, right? And then guess what? Those tactical fixes break, right? And then guess what? You've got a new MRA, right? So, or you find another one because it's still inconsistent, whatever it is. If you don't just break from that, fundamentally break from that, you're going to continue to have the same issue, right? So I think that there is an important and difficult conversation that has to be had with regulators, right, as to why this is more effective, right? Banks have to be very cautious and careful and compliant in how they migrate, but there is no choice but to migrate. It is the best and safest option for these banks to take.
At this point, it's starting to feel like we've migrated from a conversation about just technology to essentially a future state for the industry, and where the winners and losers get decided. It's almost at this point fundamental. I don't know if that's a...
Well, that's an interesting segue into the final trend, I think, right? Yeah. Number 6, which is this concept of...
Roll 6.
Right, let's bring it up. We've got to debut it here. Digital ecosystem, right? This idea of the connected ecosystem. And it's not... And so if you think about the process from pre-sales, through onboarding, through whatever the product fulfillment is, right? Ultimately into servicing that account, there's no reason why we shouldn't have all of that connected. There's not going to be one platform, right? It's not going to be one platform that connects and drives all of this information. That's not what we're proposing. But what we're saying is we need to start thinking about this as an ecosystem. We need to get out of our myopic silos, take the wide-angle lens, and look across the patch and say, how do I connect all of these systems? How does the loan servicer have the same information that the sales support person has, that the underwriter has, that the onboarding specialist has?
Time to put end-to-end in the end-to-end program.
Exactly, yeah. And actually start thinking about it end-to-end, not end-to-end from my point, from where mine starts and mine stops, which is unfortunately how we tend to think about end-to-end in today's world. So, and you mentioned it, it's not just about the technology anymore. It's about how's my process end-to-end, and how are my people integrated end-to-end. Forget the organizational structure for a second, but how do those handoffs coordinate? How are they natural? How are they aided by? How do they flow naturally by technology and with a cohesive business process?
I'm going to take and expand on this idea of the digital ecosystem and the integration a step further, right? So that end-to-end view is 100% important. And we talked about this a little bit before, but identifying the right ecosystem partners to elevate your game is a huge component of this, right? I just don't see a path where banks are going to be able to compete and keep up if they continue to think that the best path is to build everything by themselves. Now, I know that's a controversial statement. I understand that. But the reality is, if banks are going to compete, they're going to identify where their secret sauce is, leverage that, commoditize the rest, and ultimately figure out which of these partners knows something better than I do, or can do it faster than I do, and give me that competitive advantage. Because everybody's coming after me, right? Everybody is moving. This is a place where standing still will make you die, right? And I can see it over and over again. Some of these programs where we think we're smarter than everybody else, right, and we're going after it, is a real challenge, right? It doesn't mean you shouldn't go build stuff. I 100% think that there are things that banks should build. But if there's something out there in the market, I challenge you to use it and figure out where that fits in your ecosystem.
Some of this goes to the idea of who's in charge, who controls the decision making, whether it's within the company and end-to-end begins and ends at my desk, or whether it's I'm in an ecosystem and I have partners who are calling shots that I feel like should be my shots to call. What happens to break that mindset? Is it just the forces of competition or something else? Does the internal structure, decision-making team have to change and evolve?
I mean, absolutely, right? There's a difference between physical ownership and control. Yeah. And I think people need to get past that point. I think too often those two things are blurred and compared. And I think you can still have the control even if you don't have the physical asset, whatever that asset is, sitting in front of you. Right? It's to Jared's point, it's about, do you have the right partners? And whether those are internal organization partners, whether those are vendor partners, whoever they may be, do you have the right partners, and is your relationship structured in the right way? And I don't mean contractually. I mean, is your relationship structured in a way that is truly beneficial for both parties, so that it's not this master-slave relationship?
Pulling the lens back to sort of a global perspective, there are probably variations from country to country, region to region, type of bank to type of bank. Can you identify places where this is happening faster, better than other places? Yeah,
it's funny. I think there's this natural inclination to think that North America lags the rest of the world. And in commercial banking, it's actually the other way around, which is sort of fascinating, because compared to retail banking, compared to mortgage lending, compared to other areas, there's certainly other parts of the world that are far more progressive. But most of the thought leadership in commercial banking, at least over the past 3 to 4 years, has really come out of the U.S. or come out of at least North America, and we've started exporting that ideas elsewhere. Now, that's not to say that there aren't leading banks in Asia Pacific or even in Europe, but as a whole, as a collective, I think we're actually seeing that this is a rare instance where North America is leading the pack.
Looking back at the 6 trends, should the audience read anything into the sequencing, the order of it? Is this a hierarchy at the sort of
it's
most?
Not. No. I mean, so I think that there's a couple things, right? So this list of trends is not supposed to be end all be all. We know that banks have a lot of work to do. You've got to continue to focus on compliance, right? And that's going to always be there. But like the other big things that we know are out there, right? A lot of banks are dealing with an AFS level 3 mandate, so having to replace a loan servicing platform. We know banks have to deal with the cipher, the LIBOR to cipher so I can't say it today. The LIBOR transition. But so there's a lot out there. But our point here today was to really say, what are the things that are going to change the game, right? Because all those things are kind of table stakes and exist. But what are those things that are going to change the game and really build you? So think about that first, I guess that first trend around digital foundation and building beyond that. All the things that we're talking about today are saying, you've built a big foundation. You've made a massive investment. We believe there is an incremental investment from here that drives the transformation that you're looking for and builds the digital bank that you can become, right? And I think that's the key in all of this. And these are the other 5 are really the steps that get you there, in some respects. But that's the way I think about it. It's just, the idea of moving to digital, it's here, right? We thought we were going to get there already, but we're just the work over the last 5 years. While it was some of the most exciting work we've ever done in commercial banking, it just got us to the starting line, and now we're really going to move mountains, if you will.
So that there's a view that the next step has a higher multiplier value than the predecessor one.
Yep.
Okay. I think it's a good time to remind people that if they want to send us questions, there's a window on your browser that will allow you to do that, and we'll have those appearing on the screen in a moment. And also a reminder that you'll be getting a URL, accenture.com/commercialbankingtrends2020. You can visit that to find out more, download the report this is all based on, and I believe perhaps even leave questions of your own behind if you want to get in touch with someone on the team. All right, so let's pull back one more time and away from the individual trends and start talking a little bit more about the broad picture. For many people, I think there's this concern that they've heard so many of these things before, or they hear them all the time, and it's hard to separate what to really attach their attention to from what is just the latest buzz that everyone happens to be running around hyping at the given moment. What's a good takeaway for the audience, how to separate those two?
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I think we're in an age now where every bank's got their innovation lab or digital studio or is partnered with somebody. Why not bring that, whether it is a fintech or idea or whatever it is, into that lab?
Yeah.
Kick the tires on it, right? Gone are the days of paper-based RFPs and presentations, right? Let's prototype, let's build, let's ensure that it is real and it's going to work. And if it isn't, you kill it fast, right? Agile, fail fast. And if it is, by all means, go after it. So I think the days of worrying whether something is vaporware, right? It's just a sexy presentation, needs to step aside to hands-on, fingers-on keys prototyping.
Yeah. I mean, I think the other thing is, you should use us, right? I'm meeting with fintechs all the time. At least every couple of weeks I'm being introduced to somebody new. A big part of my job is to connect those dots and figure out who the best and brightest are out there and continue to evaluate how they fit in the ecosystem inside of a bank, right? We have great partnerships across the board with many of these vendors, right? So you think about, Encino, Finastra, AFS, Bit4, Zafin, Precision Lender, even some relatively new things like Oak North, right? They're out there, they're real, they're very interesting, right? And my job is to help you qualify how that fits in your company and in your bank, and make sure that it's right on your strategy and accelerates that, right? So we're there to kind of play gatekeeper to some respects, in addition to going in and trying it by yourself.
I guess some of it comes back to an honest assessment of your own strengths and weaknesses and what problem you need to be solving first or second, and migrating from that backward to what the solution might be.
Absolutely. I mean, there's still an element of prioritization here, right? You can't tackle necessarily all of this at once. So there is still an element of what is achievable at my bank, what is palatable, right? Not all of these things are going to be immediately accepted by different parts of the organization. You're going to inevitably get the organizational antibodies coming out after you, right, if you try to tackle all of these items. So there is an element of prioritization and realization and rationalization, but at least presenting these ideas, getting them out there starts to, the first step, if you will, towards this journey is awareness.
Yeah, and I do think, while you can't act on every single thing today, you're absolutely right. You have to have a plan for each of these elements, right? You just must have a plan, right? I think that you think back to the digital maturity curve we started with, right? All of the banks are sitting in level 1 and level 2, not all, but almost all, right? But what I think is going to happen in the next 2 to 3 years is that's going to fundamentally shift, and you're going to see a break, right? Right? We know, our surveys are already telling us, like, that the digital experience is going to matter to our buyers more than ever. The brand is going to matter. So if you put those two things together, who's going to have the best commercial digital brand, right? And if I'm a regional bank today and I'm looking at what's happening with somebody, even you think about the brand new Truist Bank, right, who's coming together with the idea that you bring technology together, I'm saying, how do I get a leg up on this and make sure I can compete and bring those investment dollars to bear in the most effective way? Because if you're not thinking about those things, that digital brand remains at risk, right? Because you just don't want to be the old bank who's not digital.
Organizational antibodies, by the way, is a phrase I'm going to shamelessly steal. New question just in. What's a realistic roadmap to implementation? Are there best practices for implementing technologies that you can share? This is a very how-to.
Yeah, no, it is, and we alluded to it, right? Which is set with an achievable set of goals, right? What is it you're trying to achieve? Prototype, fail fast, right? And test market it with your organization, right? In parallel, be looking at who are the vendors in this space. Back to Jared's point, building is not the answer. 9 times out of 10, building is not the answer. So who can I partner with? Who's investing in this space? Who are the leaders in this space? How can I partner with them? How can I build something that is in the best interest of both organizations that helps to leapfrog my current positioning?
One thing, I feel like I just have to say it, right? So banks got to get out of the mindset that they're going to be done, right? There's an end point. I know we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but this ongoing, consistent innovation is key. I mean, these programs that call themselves transformation, right, and that's going to be the end of it, they put all these expectations in place and it's going to be finished. That's not the way you have to think about this. How are you continuing to innovate and build on these pillars, right? Data is, and what we think about AI today and what we're going to be able to do in 5 years and 10 years, fundamentally different. So if you don't start today and you haven't cleaned up your data, right, if you haven't thought about digitizing your end-to-end process so you can actually get to that data, right, if you haven't done those steps, what are you going to do next, right? It's a matter of making sure that you think about all that ongoing innovation, process, people, technology, bringing it all together and driving that over a period of years. That is an ongoing innovation, right? It's just gone to the days of, kind of like throwing your hands up and saying, well, hurrah, I've gotten to the top of the mountain.
And to put a fine point on this is not a call for the end of the innovation lab movement. This is just a repurposing of
it's the moving it away from retail and into commercial. Yeah. Right? I mean, I hate to say it, but most of those labs were funded on the branch of the future, or how do I launch my new mobile banking platform, right? And it's repurposing or expanding the call to action for that investment.
Take a new question. How does the use of new technology impact customer relationships? Will it have more of an impact on particular categories of customers?
Yeah, so let me start. So I think it's a great question, right? And I think the customer expectations are migrating, right? I think that, the good news is everybody's in the same pack, right, in the commercial bank today, right? So everybody kind of expects to, upload their financial statements more than once, every once in a while. Everybody expects it to take forever to kind of get money, right, onboard a new treasury management platform, product, all those things. We know that those aren't going to be great, right? So I think in today's environment, customers sort of accept that this is just the way banking is done, right? But that is changing. And I think that the impact and the expectations, be it a digital challenger or this bank we talked about is, getting decisions made, in a day. When you put those things together, those expectations fundamentally change, right? Now, I think as I think about the categories, I think that, again, I think the SME banking is the sweetest, right? If you just think about moving from retail up, right? The largest amount of client impact, right? The highest number, right? The simplest tasks, not that they're simple, but the simplest task, that's where we're going to see the impact next, right? The further you go up the curve, while you'll see things, I think they'll be, very, very specific to a point solution for a specific issue. Anything you'd add?
Yeah, just that, look, Amazon, Google, everybody's made our lives so much easier. Everyone is starting to expect that same level of interaction regardless of their role. So regardless of whether you're a small business owner, you're the controller of a major corporation, you want that interaction. You want that ease of use, and those personal consumer-led, if you will, expectations are bleeding and have bled into commercial. And people are just frustrated when they have to rekey information, right? Why does applying for a loan or onboarding a new account feel like a root canal? Right. So how do we get past that point to which it's an easy, pleasurable experience where I type in my information, I click OK, and I'm done?
I have to believe on some level, getting retail customers to change their behavior, migrating things to a phone or whatever it is a little easier than getting a corporation to change its behavior and its habits in response to.
We could try.
Fair enough. Okay, this one. Outside of these trends, what else should a commercial banker be thinking about against a backdrop? I guess a post-digital backdrop, or frame it any way you like.
Yeah, look, I think that a couple things come to mind, right? So there's a wave of M&A probably coming, right? So how does that affect my strategy, right? It also means that how do I make sure that I continue to be a winner in that environment? I know I've got, we talked about, LIBOR, we talked about, loan servicing replacement, right? We know those things are out there. Keeping those front of mind is key. One thing that I think that is really important through all of this is the employee, right? We talked about the customer, but the employee, right? So you think about change management, adoption, all those kind of things. Let's go back to, I talked about the arms that are hunters, right? Okay, if you stand in a room of RMs and say, hey, you're all hunters, I want you to be or you're all farmers, I want you to be hunters tomorrow. Well, I've alienated everybody, right? And I've scared the heck out of them, right? That's not an approach you can take, right? You've got to think about how you are bringing your workforce along, not exhausting them with change, but driving towards this with them, understanding what is important, where the value is, right? And ultimately, how you drive with those employees to that next level. Because this is about them just as much as anybody else. And if your employees aren't on board, the programs are going to fail anyhow, right? And ultimately, customers aren't going to be happy. So the employee is probably your number one customer in many respects through all of this.
This one's a very simple question. So you're ready to go. How do you get started?
Look, if you back to trend number one, if you haven't already started, get on with it, right? you are behind. Yeah. If you've done the digital foundation, right? If you're whether you're on that path or you've completed that first foundational step, now do something with it. Mm-hmm. Now it's time to move on. Now it's time to say, how do I take that substantial investment I've made and start to really reap the benefits?
Yeah. Now, I was with the bank just yesterday who's asked me the question and said, I've gone through a Salesforce implementation, I've gone through an Encino implementation, what should I be doing next, right? And is actually beginning to go down that path very strategically to ask that set of questions. That sounds like a no-brainer, but that's the only bank that's asking that question that thoughtfully and that strategically, right? So I think that there is, again, I go back to the winners and losers are being defined right now as we speak, right? This bank is taking a leg up because they're saying, we've done these things. We're not done with those, but we have to put the roadmap together right now to know how all this fits together for our future. So, I think it's just make sure you're continuously thinking about where you're going, not completing and saying you're done.
It was a great conversation. That's all the time we have. I want to thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to Accenture for making today's program possible. I wish you all a great 2020. Thanks for being with us.